Right, now in the second part we'll continue with the fields and distance, and the emphasis will be on getting the tonal values, making sure that we've got all of the light fields and the dark trees, so that the relationship between the lights and the darks in reality is reflected in the difference between the darks and lights in my painting. Right, well, let's make a start with these distant trees, aureolin and a bit of raw sienna, just to push the light a little bit across here. This paper, by the way, let's put a bit of raw umber with it now, just to dull it down as we go over here, and then it turns to a very lightish green. This paper, by the way, is a little bit of Saunders Waterford rough, £200. It's not a paper it's fairly new to me actually, this paper, but a lot of my painting friends use it, so I thought, oh, I'll try it out. I didn't want to sort of think I was missing out on anything. It takes the paint nicely, has a nice surface, although I will admit that I prefer what you might call the back side of it, rather than the side where you can read the watermark. That side always looks a little bit, the texture looks a little bit regular to me. Although once you start painting, I have to say it's not as obvious. A little bit of warmth appearing on some of these trees, which I'll just push, early signs of autumn. And of the distant trees, let's put a bit of ultramarine, bit more quite dark, but if I make them a bit more bluey, keep the edges nice and soft, that will help, in conjunction with them actually just being a bit smaller, it'll help indicate they're just that little bit further away. Make that even more bluey. Don't be frightened of pushing the colour. If it looks attractive and plausible, and then you'll get away with it, I think. Now this larger tree here, ultramarine and raw sienna, I think. So the ultramarine will again help push it into the distance. It just goes behind that. And then the large focal point tree, and some slightly darker greens and darker colours just in the footer underneath these, sort of underneath the trees there. Virgin and raw umber. A bit more raw sienna. Every time I go back to the palette, I always say this, I pick up some different colour. It's a series of little bushes on this hedgerow here. Just make that one a little bit bigger to drive it into the distance. Virgin and burnt sienna will give me a rich dark green, not too much water. The paper's still wet, so I can utilise the moisture on the paper to help that wash. And add a little bit more texture to this tree here. And these bushes which I've moved across to have a sort of full stop. A bit more raw sienna. Just covering up those little bits of white fleck. And then some ultramarine, always pure ultramarine, to just give me that shadow across there, which I'll just exaggerate a tiny bit. Then come back and put some lighter colour there. Now the last thing I'll do in this section is get all of this foreground covered with this rich green. Now notice I don't put a great puddle of water and add colour to my puddle of water. What I find there's enough moisture on the brush, so I tend to just try a little bit of sap green with that. I tend to add water to paint, not paint to water. And your raw sienna in this tiny bit of tiny little bit of cadmium orange. Now the sun is full on this field, so a little bit of sparkle, and from the texture of the dry paper, paint with broad horizontal strokes. Now there's a big cast shadow on the field from the trees behind me, so I'll paint right over this and then we'll put the shadow in when that's all nice and dry. I always think of cast shadows going on top of lighter areas. A little bit of glazing there just to connect those. Now the last thing I'll do in this part is to put a preliminary wash on the all-important focal point of this large oak tree covered in ivy. It'll need a little bit more work as it's going to be the main centre of interest in the painting. Now it's important when you do this tree is to ask yourself, is the degree of difference between the light sky and the dark tree I'm about to paint going to be the same as the difference between the light sky in reality and the dark tree? I don't worry too much about getting the exact botanical green, mainly because I'm not able to do that, but I do worry about making sure I've got the paint dark enough when I need it to be dark and light enough when I need it to be light. And don't forget, it dries lighter. So let's see what that looks like. Yep, that's a nice colour. Make sure that you preserve any little sky holes. That's very important. Just occasionally I might dip into something slightly lighter where I feel it's catching the sun. And if anything, I might even exaggerate the size of the sky holes. It's all sort of tumbling down there. It's important to get it's just the character of the tree, and like painting a person, very often the character of the person is just in their general stance, the way they carry themselves, and it's the same with the tree. Anything which is slightly bent over, let's put in these trunks or branches which are always visible where there's what you might call a sky hole. This comes down here. A little bit lighter here. Hold the brush at the end so that you can sort of move it a little bit more freely, very much in the way the tree has grown. And I don't like to do too much in the way of drawing when it comes to painting trees, because it sort of constrains the way you put the paint on. Keep that nice, and we've got that a little bit too light, but I don't want to go too dark because there's going to be a dark shadow on the right hand side. And of course, if I go too dark, this is a mistake some people make. If you go too dark too soon, then you've left yourself nowhere to go to get the next dark. You've sort of shot your bolt, as it were. Now while that's drying, we might be able to have a go at this shadow over the foreground. Ultramarine, a little bit of light red. I'll keep it nice and blue. This tiny little bit of, might be a bit too blue. Let's put a bit more raw sienna with it. Quite dappled in places. And there's some shadows that are sort of pointing towards the tree coming from the right, which I'll steal and move because they're a nice sort of compositional element to add. A little bit of texture for these. To this field, it's a sugar beet field actually. Now all of this is really to drive the viewer into the picture so that they look towards the light. Just get rid of some of that sparkle there. I'm used to painting on Bockingford paper, and I have to say this is probably paper that's easier to paint on than Bockingford. A little bit more forgiving. And a little bit of dark on the bottom of this bank here. Just lift that up a bit and just try and join that so it looks as if the tree is made friends with the bank that it's growing out of. Much harder to do that sort of thing on Bockingford than it is on this paper. Right, we'll leave that, and then in the last part we'll add a little bit more definition of darks and cast shadows, and then I think we'll be done.